The dog was already dead. That was what Callum thought when he first saw her, half buried in the ditch along the highway shoulder outside Merritt, British Columbia, her dark coat nearly invisible against the frozen gravel. He had almost driven past. He almost did. It was the kind of February morning that made everything feel like a mistake. The sky the color of old pewter, the temperature sitting at -19 without the wind, the highway empty in both directions as far as Callum Reyes had been driving since 4 in the morning, the same way he drove most mornings now, not going anywhere in particular. Just moving, because moving was easier than sitting still in that house. He pulled the truck over. He told himself it was reflex. 22 years in the Navy, 8 of them as a SEAL, and your body just responds before your brain catches up. You see something that shouldn't be, and you stop. You assess. That was all it was. He stepped out into the cold and the wind hit him like something personal. She was not dead. She was a shepherd mix. The big, heavy-boned kind, with a broad face and ears that couldn't quite decide whether to stand or fold. She was lying on her side in the ditch, with her body curved around something, and when Callum came close enough to see what it was, he stopped walking for a moment. 4 puppies. Maybe 5 weeks old. Maybe less. They were pressed so tight against their mother that at first they looked like one animal. She had been using her own body as a windbreak, her back turned to the highway, holding whatever warmth she still had between herself and the gravel. She looked up at him. She didn't growl. She didn't try to run. She just looked at him with dark eyes that had already stopped asking for anything. And that was the thing that got him. Not the puppies. Not the cold. It was the way she had just accepted it. Whatever was coming, she had accepted it, and she was still there, still holding her body around those pups, because that was the only thing left she could do. Callum had not cried at his wife's funeral. He had stood at the graveside in Kamloops with his hands at his sides and his jaw locked, and he had not cried, not once, through any of it. People kept saying he was strong. He did not feel strong. He felt like a man standing in a field where everything had been harvested, looking at the empty rows, not sure what he was supposed to do with all that space. He didn't cry in the ditch either. He just crouched down, very slowly, and held out his hand and waited. She sniffed his fingers. Her nose was dry and cracked from the cold. "Okay," he said. "Okay, let's go." He carried her first, because she was too weak to walk on her own, settling her across the back seat of the truck, with her head resting on his folded jacket. Then he went back for the puppies, gathering them up two at a time in his hands, their small bodies so cold they barely moved. 4 of them. He counted twice. He cranked the heat up as high as it would go and pulled back onto the highway. The nearest vet clinic was 45 minutes away in Merritt. He called ahead. They were ready for him when he arrived. His name was Callum Reyes, and he was 53 years old, and he lived alone in a house on the edge of Nicola Lake that he and his wife, Sandra, had bought the summer before she got sick. They had meant it to be the next chapter. The one after the deployments and the postings and the years of her holding things together while he was gone. They had talked about a garden, a kayak, a dog, eventually. Sandra had always wanted a dog. She died 14 months after the diagnosis. That was 18 months ago now. Callum had stayed in the house because leaving felt like agreeing to something he wasn't ready to agree to. He'd taken on some contract work, security consulting, the kind of thing his background made easy and his mind made hollow. He drove in the mornings. He split firewood in the afternoons. He ate whatever was simplest to make, and he slept badly, and he did not call his daughter in Edmonton nearly as often as he should have, because every time he heard her voice he heard Sandra in it, and that undid him in a way that combat never had. He had not planned on a dog. He had not planned on 5 dogs. The vet in Merritt, a small, direct woman named Dr. Hannah Park who spoke like she had no interest in cushioning anything, told him the mother was severely malnourished and hypothermic but alive. 3 of the 4 puppies were in reasonable shape. The 4th, the smallest one, a male with 1 white paw, was touch and go. "You brought them in fast," Dr. Park said. "Another hour in that cold and we'd be having a different conversation." Callum stood in the waiting room with his hands in his pockets and said nothing. "Is this your dog?" she asked. "No." "Are you keeping her?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "I don't know." Dr. Park studied him for a moment in the way that people who deal with animals all day learn to study human beings. She's going to need somewhere to recover, somewhere warm and quiet, at least 3 weeks. He drove home that evening with a borrowed crate in the back seat, 2 wool blankets the clinic had given him, and a sheet of instructions he'd already memorized. The mother dog lay across the seat with her head on his jacket again, not sleeping, just watching the road through half-closed eyes. The puppies were staying at the clinic for the next 48 hours under observation. When he got home, he carried her inside and set her up near the wood stove in the corner of the living room. He built the fire up and sat across from her in the armchair. She watched him. He watched her. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. He wasn't sure who he was talking to. She put her head down on her paws. He named her Scout. It wasn't a name he'd planned. It just came out when he was on the phone the next morning telling Dr. Park he'd be in to check on the puppies. The mother. "Scout, how is she eating?" There was a brief pause on the other end. "Scout," Dr. Park repeated, and he could hear something in her voice that wasn't quite a smile. "She's doing better." His closest neighbor was a man named Walt Drennan, who lived about a kilometer down the lake road in a house that looked like it had been built in stages over several decades, each additions slightly at odds with the last. Walt was 71, a former long-haul trucker from Newfoundland who had come west for work in the 80s and never left. He had a beard that had been white since he was 50, and a laugh that you could hear from across the water on quiet days. They had not been close. Callum and Sandra had introduced themselves when they'd moved in, and Walt had brought over a bottle of rye and a jar of partridge-berry jam from his sister back in Clarenville, and that had been the extent of it. Callum was not a man who sought neighbors out, and Walt seemed to understand that without needing to be told. Walt's dog had died in November, a big old lab named Curly who had, according to Walt, been the best truck dog in British Columbia and possibly on Earth. Callum had heard about it from Dr. Park, who had treated Curly for years. She mentioned it the way people mention things they think you might already know. Callum hadn't known. He drove down the lake road on a Tuesday afternoon, about a week after bringing Scout home. He wasn't sure why. He told himself he was checking on the old man. It was cold. It had snowed again the night before, and Walt's truck hadn't moved in a few days. That was a reasonable thing to notice about a 71-year-old man living alone. Walt answered the door in a flannel shirt and wool socks, holding a mug of tea, looking like he'd been expecting someone but wasn't sure who. "Callum," he said. "Walt." They stood there for a moment. "You'd better come in then," Walt said. The house was warm and somewhat cluttered and smelled like wood smoke and old coffee. There were photographs on the wall beside the wood stove. A woman who must have been Walt's wife, young in some of them, older in others. A grown son with Walt's same wide face, a dog in almost every frame, always the same dog. They sat at the kitchen table with their mugs and said very little for a while, which was comfortable in the way that silence can be comfortable between two men who both understand that some things resist being talked about. Eventually Walt said, "I heard you pulled some dogs out of a ditch." "News travels," Callum said. "Hannah Park talks." Walt shrugged. "She saved Curly's life twice, so I give her the gossip tax." Callum told him about that morning on the highway. The ditch, the cold, the way the mother dog had just looked at him without asking for anything. Walt listened without interrupting, which Callum appreciated. "How many pups?" Walt asked. 4. The little one, the one with the white paw, he's still at the clinic. But he's eating. Walt wrapped both hands around his mug and looked out the window at the lake. "Curly had puppies once," he said. "Years back. 7 of them." He paused. "You forget how small they are." Callum nodded. "You keeping them?" Walt asked. "The pups?" "I can't keep 5 dogs." "No," Walt agreed. "But you could keep one." Callum looked at him. "Or someone else could," Walt said, and looked back at the window and said nothing more about it. The little one with the white paw came home on a Thursday. Dr. Park carried him out to the truck herself, which she said she didn't usually do, and handed him over with the particular care of someone releasing something they'd worried about. "He's a fighter," she said. "Give him another 4 weeks and he'll be causing trouble." Callum held the puppy against his chest for the drive home. He was barely larger than both hands put together. He slept the whole way, making small sounds that weren't quite snoring. Scout was at the door when they came in. She sniffed the puppy all over in that thorough, serious way that dogs have, then carried him by the scruff of his neck to the blanket nest near the stove and deposited him between her front legs. The other 3 pups piled in around him. Callum stood in the doorway of his own living room and watched this, and something happened in his chest that he didn't have an immediate name for. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was more like the feeling of a room that has been empty for a long time and is, without fanfare, occupied again. He called his daughter, Bryn, that night. He called her on video, which he almost never did, and she picked up on the second ring with the expression of someone bracing themselves, because that was what he had trained her to expect. "Dad, hi. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," he said, and turned the phone so she could see Scout and the puppies on the blanket. "I have some dogs." There was a pause, and then Bryn started to laugh. A real laugh, not a polite one, and she said, "Oh my God, Dad, they're so small." And she leaned toward the screen, and he watched her face do the thing it used to do when she was young, and something delighted her. And he thought about how much she looked like her mother when she did that, and for once the thought did not feel like a door closing. "The little one with the white paw," he said. "He almost didn't make it." But he did. Bryn wiped her eye with the heel of her hand in a way she probably thought he didn't notice. "What are you going to do with them?" "Find them homes," Callum said. Most of them. He looked at the puppy with the white paw, who had wriggled free of his mother and was now determinedly climbing over his brother's head. "Most of them," he said again. He called the puppy patch, for reasons that required no explanation. Finding homes for the other 3 took 3 weeks. Dr. Park put a notice up at the clinic, and within 10 days 2 of the puppies, a female and the largest male, had been spoken for by families in Merritt. The 3rd went to a young woman in Kamloops who drove out specifically to meet them and sat on Callum's living room floor for 20 minutes, letting the puppy chew on her fingers before she said yes. Callum watched each of them go. He had expected to feel relieved. He felt something more complicated than that. A low-grade tenderness that surprised him, the way you can be surprised by your own feelings when you've spent a long time keeping them at arm's length. Walt came down the road one afternoon while the last family was there collecting their pup. He stood in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets and watched without saying much until they'd driven away. "How many left?" he asked. 2, Callum said. "Scout and Patch." Walt nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something confirms what he already suspected. "Well," he said, "that works out then." Callum looked at him. "Does it? I've got a big yard," Walt said, "and nobody's using it." There was something careful in his voice, the way there is with men who don't like to ask directly for the things they need. Callum had learned to hear that register. He'd had to learn it about himself first. "You want a dog," Callum said. "I want company," Walt said, more quietly than he'd probably meant to. The dog is the decent way of saying it. They stood in the yard for a moment. The lake was frozen to about halfway across, and the afternoon light was coming in low and pale gold through the pines, the kind of light that only happens in winter in that part of the country, long and sideways and strangely beautiful. "Come inside," Callum said. "I'll put the kettle on." Walt took Scout. It was not a decision that was made all at once. It happened over a series of afternoons. Walt coming down the road to sit with her near the stove, Scout accepting him in the gradual, evaluating way that dogs accept new people. Cautiously at first, then a paw on the knee, then a head in the lap. By the 3rd week of March she was following him to the door when he got up to leave, and that was enough. The day Walt took her home, Callum carried her bed and her blanket and her food dishes down the road in the truck. He walked through Walt's door and got the place set up and showed Walt everything. Dr. Park had written down about her diet and her medications. She was still on a few supplements, and Walt listened and wrote things down on a notepad. Even though Callum suspected he would remember all of it without needing to. "She likes the fire," Callum said. "On her left side. Something happened to the right. Don't make a fuss about it." "How do you know?" Walt asked. "You watch," Callum said simply. Walt looked at him for a moment. "You're good at watching." "Had to be," Callum said, "in my line of work." Walt nodded. He knew something about Callum's line of work. Not everything. Not the specific deployments or the specific losses, but enough. "Must be strange," he said. turning that off. Callum thought about Sandra, about the way he had been so good at reading terrain, reading rooms, reading men with bad intentions, and he had not seen it coming, had not seen any of it coming. Even when she was sitting across from him in the kitchen in Kamloops with something in her eyes she didn't know how to say yet. "I haven't turned it off," he said. "I've just got nothing to point it at." Walt was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Maybe that's what they're for." He looked down at Scout, who had already found the corner nearest the wood stove and settled herself into it. Something to pay attention to. March came in hard and went out gently, the way it sometimes did in the interior. The snow on the lake began to pull back from the shore, and the morning stopped feeling quite so hostile. Callum built a small enclosure off the side of the house for Patch, who had grown into something between a shepherd and whatever else was in his bloodline. Long-legged, quick-eyed, with that one white paw that made him look like he was wearing a glove he'd borrowed from someone else. He was not an easy puppy. He chewed things with commitment and barked at the lake with a seriousness that suggested personal grievance. He figured out how to open the back door in week 2 and spent an afternoon rearranging the firewood pile before Callum noticed. He was, in short, exhausting and alive in a way that demanded something of everyone in his vicinity. Callum had not understood, until Patch, how much he needed to be demanded of. There is a specific kind of loneliness that belongs to capable people. People who are skilled and competent and trained for difficulty, and who find themselves, suddenly, with no difficulty to be useful toward. Callum had been living in that loneliness for 18 months. It is the loneliness of a hand that has forgotten it is a hand. Patch did not allow for it. Patch needed feeding and training and watching and walking, and a response to all of his questions, which were constant and physical and expressed mostly through his teeth and his paws. He dragged Callum back into time, into the ordinary forward movement of days that have things to do in them. Bryn came in April. She drove from Edmonton in a rented SUV and arrived at 7 in the evening when the sky was still light, the long prairie-to-mountain light of spring, and Patch announced her arrival from the end of the driveway at considerable volume. She was 31, and she looked so much like her mother sometimes that it stopped Callum cold in unexpected moments. She had Sandra's way of walking into a room like she'd already decided to like it. She crouched in the driveway and let Patch investigate her thoroughly. "This is the fighter," she said. "That's him." Patch put his paw on her knee and looked at her. She looked back. Some kind of agreement was reached between them. "Mom would have loved him," Bryn said. It was not a sad sentence. It was just true, stated plainly, the way Bryn had begun to say true things about her mother in the past several months. Not flinching away from them, not performing around them, just saying them. Callum didn't know when she'd learn to do that. He suspected she'd learned it without anyone teaching her. She would have, he said. They went inside and he made dinner. A proper dinner. The first time he'd really cooked in longer than he wanted to calculate. And they sat at the table, by the window overlooking the lake, and Patch laid himself across Bryn's feet, and they talked for a long time. They talked about Sandra without the careful silence around her name. They talked about the house and the lake, and what Callum thought he might do with the spring. They talked about Walt and Scout, and Bryn wanted to walk down the road to meet them both the next day, and they did. Walt made tea, and Scout sat between Walt and Bryn on the couch, while the old man told stories about Curly and the long-haul years in Newfoundland in the summers of his childhood, and Bryn listened the way she had always been good at listening. Fully, generously, without rushing toward the end of things. Walking back along the lake road in the afternoon, Bryn said, "He's lonely." "He was lonelier," Callum said. Bryn looked at him. "So were you." He didn't answer that because she wasn't asking. She was just saying it the way she said true things, plainly without accusation. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I was." The ice was nearly gone from the lake. There were birds back in the pines. The world was doing its slow, annual work of coming back to itself. And he was standing in it, and his daughter was walking beside him, and somewhere behind them, Walt Drennan was sitting with a dog who had almost frozen to death in a ditch and was now sleeping with her head in an old man's lap. He thought about Sandra. He did not think about her the way he had been thinking about her for 18 months, like pressing on a bruise, over and over, half punishment and half compulsion. He thought about her the way you think about someone you love, which is to say gently, and with gratitude, and with the particular ache that is not emptiness, but its opposite. She had always wanted a dog. He had gotten 5. He thought she would have found that funny. He thought she would have sat on the floor with the puppies the way Bryn's friend from Kamloops had done, cross-legged, letting them climb on her, laughing. He could see it clearly. He had been afraid, for a long time, that he was losing the ability to see her clearly. But she was there, not gone, just quieter now, taking up the space she'd always taken up in him, different in shape but not smaller. He had not saved her. He had never been able to save her. And there was still something in him that would always carry the helplessness of that, the specific grief of a man trained to handle emergencies, who could not handle the most important one of his life. That did not go away. He did not expect it to. But there had been a morning in February when he had pulled over on a frozen highway, and a dying dog had looked up at him without asking for anything, and he had stayed anyway. He was still figuring out what that meant. He thought he might be figuring it out for a while yet. Back at the house, Patch was waiting at the door with one of Callum's work gloves in his mouth, thrilled with himself, entirely unrepentant. Callum took the glove back. Patch sat down and looked up at him with the bright, expectant, fundamentally hopeful expression that dogs carry, always like they know something the rest of us are still working toward. "Yeah," Callum said. "I know." He opened the door and they went inside together.